2025. It is a new year, but the conflict in Ukraine continues to grind on. I want to talk about the current state of the conflict, the trajectory that it is on, and where this will bring us throughout this new year. And I will start by taking a look at the map. This is liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian, pro-Western live map, so keep that in mind as we take a look at it. But even looking at this pro-Ukrainian map, just over the last week, you can see Russian gains continue to expand along the line of contact. Now, this is the overview of the map. This is Ukraine. In red are areas Russia has taken and now incorporates into the Russian Federation. This lighter red are areas in Russia affected most by the fighting. And if we zoom in from Kherson in the south along the Dnieper River to Zaporozhye, to the Donbas region and Kharkov, these are the main areas the fighting is taking place. There's also this incursion by Ukrainian forces into Kursk. And as you can see, their area of operation has shrunk. They are being pushed back to Sudzha, the one relatively significant population center they managed to take during this incursion. They are falling back to there. They risk being cut off by Russian forces pushing in around the border in the southern area of this incursion. And we will talk about that later because the Western media is reporting on that. Now, of course, the main gains Russia is making right now is in the Donbas region. On the approach and around the area Pokrovsk, there is this salient here that has expanded from Donetsk, having Russian forces having taken Avdiivka at the beginning of 2023, and now having moved all the way up to Pokrovsk. You can see how Russian forces approach Pokrovsk, and now they are circling around. And this salient continues to grow. It has absorbed Kurakovo. And again, if we use the timeline function, even as recently as January 1st, that is what the map looked like according to this pro-Ukrainian map. This is what it looks like today on January 5th. And this trend is only going to not just continue, but it is going to continue accelerating. That is what it has done all throughout the last year. That is what it is going to do this year. Ukrainian forces are deteriorating. The inability of the collective West to supply Ukraine with enough arms and ammunition, coupled together with just the reality that you cannot absorb huge amounts of arms and ammunition and weapon systems, especially weapon systems you're not familiar with. You cannot absorb it fast enough to use it in the first place, even if it existed, but it doesn't exist. That is the problem Ukraine faces. Difficult choices lie ahead for the collective West, which is essentially fighting Russia through this proxy war in Ukraine. They're going to have to either accept that their proxy war has failed and accept the collapse of the Ukrainian military, the fact that Russia will shape the outcome of whatever is left of Ukraine, or they're going to have to contemplate direct intervention. This has been a threat all throughout this entire conflict. The conflict is basically a result of Russian fears that the US and the rest of NATO were going to NATOize and militarily occupy Ukraine right on Russia's border in the first place. That is why this conflict began in the first place. NATO encroachment all along Russia's border and now in Ukraine, which Russia has repeatedly over many years stated was a red line. And of course, for skeptics who say nations have a right to join NATO, NATO is not a threat to Russia, Russia is overreacting, we're simply using this as a pretext. The US admittedly has attempted to overthrow multiple nations along Russia's periphery, including Ukraine, all the way back in 2004, as a matter of fact. It was admitted in the Western media, this Guardian article, U.S. campaign behind the turmoil in Kiev, the first attempt by the U.S. to overthrow a neutral Ukrainian government and install a pro-U.S., pro-NATO regime into power. It's admitted the U.S. government was completely involved. It was funded, directed, organized by the U.S. government and the many agencies it uses to intervene and interfere in the politics of targeted nations around the globe, not just in Europe. And they admit not just Ukraine, but also Serbia, Belarus, and Georgia. And we have to remember that in Georgia, the U.S. successfully overthrew the neutral government there, installed the client regime. From 2003 to 2008, began arming and training the Georgian military. In 2008, according to an EU investigation, Georgian forces attacked Russian peacekeepers, precipitating that war in 2008. And so when the U.S. began this very same process in the much larger, more populous Ukraine, they feared that this whole process was going to repeat itself up to and including U.S.-trained and armed Ukrainian forces in much larger numbers attacking Russia again. And so that's what you have to keep in mind as this conflict unfolds throughout the rest of 2025. Keep in mind why it's being fought in the first place. Now let's talk about the deterioration of Ukraine's armed forces. This is something that I have been covering for years now, not just the inability of the West to supply Ukraine with arms and ammunition, but the inability of Ukraine itself to conscript and train properly enough soldiers to replace their losses just to match, let alone exceed, the military power of Russia, which has been growing continuously since this conflict began and even before the conflict began. I want to show you this article from the Business Insider. This was something that I had predicted would happen as far back as June of last year. And this is about this French-trained Ukrainian brigade that French President Emmanuel Macron said he would train last year in June and then have sent to Ukraine. Well, this is how it started. This was June 6, 2024, Macron to supply Ukraine with Mirage 2000 TAC-5 warplanes and train pilots and troops in France. And if you come down here, he said France would equip and train an entire brigade of 4,500 Ukrainian soldiers so they can defend themselves when they return to Ukraine from training. Now, I made a whole video about this, and I want to share with you what I had said back in June 2024. Let's listen. He, as in French President Macron, said France would equip and train an entire brigade of 4,500 Ukrainian soldiers so they can defend themselves when they return to Ukraine from training. So they're going from Ukraine to France to train 4,500 Ukrainians, and then they're going back to Ukraine, trained and equipped by France. Now, I've done entire videos about how unrealistic it is to just build up a brigade over the course of a couple of months or even a year or two. It's extremely unrealistic. And we remember that Ukraine tried to stand up multiple brigades ahead of its 2023 offensive, and we see they were wiped out. They were eliminated. The remaining brigades that are still fighting on, they're fighting on into oblivion right now, being used as reserves, trying to fill in all the many and growing gaps along the line of contact. So that was an unsuccessful effort at standing up brigades in far too short of a period of time. I talked about how even under ideal conditions, it could take 1 to 2 years to stand up a brigade. And that's if you have the trained manpower to just assemble into a brigade and then train as a brigade. The problem Ukraine has is they don't even have that type of manpower on hand. A brigade is more than just 4,500 conscripts given basic training and weapons and then sent into battle. A brigade is an organization with a hierarchy, with units within units that make up the entire brigade. And you need to have entry-level soldiers at every level, each unit, but you also need to have specialists and leadership positions leading each one of those units, and then, of course, the entire brigade itself. And that type of experience, that type of leadership, training, and experience takes years to acquire, and Ukraine is out of that type of experienced manpower. Long ago, they ran out of that type of manpower. They're not putting brigades back together again. They're not building new brigades, especially not in a couple of months, 6 months, or a year's time. That will never happen. If people remember, NATO actually stood up multiple brigades between 2014 and 2022 before the special military operation began. All of those brigades, even according to Western analysts, have been completely eliminated. All that manpower is gone. If the brigade exists, it's because there was turnover, and everyone in that brigade is a replacement of those original troops trained by NATO over the course of those 8 years. So if that is what 8 years of effort produced, what can France produce in, say, 6 months to a year or even 2 years? Nothing. The answer is nothing, nothing of any substance. And we're talking about a conflict where even Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky had previously admitted Ukraine was losing 300 troops a day during the fighting in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. So they are certainly losing many more than that per day. But let's just go with 300 a day. That means they're losing 2 brigades worth of men every single month. So what is France building? One poorly trained, almost certainly poorly equipped brigade over the course of several months. How is that going to change the calculus on the battlefield in Ukraine? It's not going to. And since we're talking about NATO training, France being a NATO member, let's look at some of the deep problems with NATO training. Let's ask ourselves what experience France has fighting in a conflict featuring the type of warfare unfolding in Ukraine right now. The answer is they have none. They have no experience fighting that type of conflict. So how are they going to train Ukrainians to be prepared for that type of fighting? They can't. And so how has this turned out? Did it turn out the way I warned it would? Of course it did, and much more. Ukraine is investigating its special French-trained brigade after reports of mass desertion and command problems. I think you'll remember me specifically pointing out the problem Ukraine has standing up an entire brigade, the lack of trained and experienced leadership that is required to stand up new military units. You're not just training 4,500 conscripts, basic combat skills, giving them a gun and sending them to the front line. That is not how combat has ever worked. You need officers to organize and lead these men in battle. So let's read what the article says. Ukraine's State Bureau of Investigation is probing a brigade specially trained to use French weapons after reports that hundreds of soldiers deserted the unit. Actually, more than 1,000, actually, almost 2,000. The infantry brigade named Anne of Kiev after an 11th century Kiev princess who became a queen of France has about 5,800 soldiers. Around 2,000 of them underwent months of training in France in 2024. So it sounds like France fell far short of their target of 4,500. Again, not a surprise. There, they enjoyed a relatively high profile. French President Emmanuel Macron personally met several of the 155th Brigade during a public visit to a French base in October last year, 2024. Paris armed the brigade with its own weaponry, including 18 AMX-10 armored vehicles, 18 truck-mounted Caesar howitzers, and 128 armored troop carriers. The unit also fields some of Germany's prized Leopard 2A4 main battle tanks. I don't know why they're prized. They have performed terribly in this conflict, practically useless. By November, the 155th was sent to hit the front lines. So not even 6 months of training, not even a half year of training, when in reality a new brigade would require most likely 3 years at least to be effective on the battlefield. With French officials saying these Ukrainian troops were now equipped to fight with Western battlefield training. I want to remind people again, as I did back in June of last year, that NATO spent 8 years preparing Ukrainian brigades to fight Russia, and those brigades have now been wiped out. What hope, what chance did a brigade trained for less than half a year by France, by French troops who have no experience fighting a conflict like this, what chance did they have? The answer, again, was none. They had zero chance. This AMX-10 that they're talking about is this wheeled armored vehicle with light armor, this large gun, possibly useful for reconnaissance, but not really. and has proven completely useless throughout this conflict. People must remember that the AMX-10 was sent to Ukraine ahead of its 2023 offensive, which utterly failed, was completely defeated, categorically, comprehensively defeated by Russia. The Caesar howitzers are self-propelled. They're relatively modern, advanced, most likely capable under certain conditions, but not under the intense conditions in this conflict. They fire 155 millimeter artillery rounds, which, as we all know, are in short supply. They have been throughout the conflict, and they will remain scarce into the foreseeable future. And again, the Leopard 2 main battle tank, completely useless. Number one, there is no capability the Leopard tank possesses that makes it any better suited than the tanks Ukraine originally started out with. Because Ukraine doesn't have any of those original tanks left, that is why they were given Leopards, not because they have any sort of special capability, but just because that is what is available. And the problem is, again, incorporating a new weapon system into an armed force requires years of preparations, training, changes in doctrine. None of this could possibly have been achieved in such a short period of time. And so this is why it has failed, and this is why it will continue to fail. Now, here is the video that that clip is from. The link to this will be in the video description below, including the timestamp where it actually starts, where I explain about this. Will French jets, additional U.S. arms, help change the tide in Ukraine? And I also talk about a previous video where I went in depth about building up new brigades based on a paper published by a U.S. military officer who was talking about how difficult it is to actually stand up brigades. So that is in this video. This will also be in the video description below, as will be the paper that I cited talking about expanding brigade combat teams. Is the training base adequate? And you will see how complicated in reality standing up a new brigade is, and how Ukraine has no possibility of doing this during this conflict. It will not happen. It cannot happen, which is what makes Western intervention more and more likely as more and more people come to this realization. Back to the Business Insider report. They give more details about all of this. So they talk about a report by Ukrainian journalist Yuri Budasov, who said the brigade had been buckling from desertion and leadership issues. Again, where are you going to find well-trained, experienced leadership? It does not exist in Ukraine at this point, not on the scale that it needs to build new brigades. Even before it was deployed to Pokrovsk, so even before it saw combat, which again is no surprise. Poor leadership means poor discipline, means a lack of motivation and an interest in desertion. Before the brigade fired the first shot, 1,700 servicemen left it voluntarily, he said. He did not provide evidence for his claim, but published a tally of the unit's strength over time that said hundreds of men deserted monthly from March to November, forcing the 155th to keep replenishing personnel. A key factor in the desertion rate, he wrote, was that many in the unit had been forcibly recruited off of Ukraine's streets. We've seen videos of this. We've seen the Western media finally admit to this. About 50 men also went AWOL, absent without leave, while the unit was training in France. So again, a lot of people predicted this would happen. Also, you send Ukrainians who already don't want to fight to Europe, Western Europe, to train at any opportunity, and they're very wise to do so. They're going to try to disappear in that country. Uncertainty also hangs over the 155th's leadership. Days into its deployment on the front line, the brigade's commander abruptly announced that he would step down. He was a seasoned officer with experience commanding 2 other brigades. He thanked his troops in a Facebook post saying that the 155th had undergone a tough but significant journey, and he was replaced by Colonel Maximov Viktorovich, a former commander of the 14th Mechanized Brigade. Again, trouble with leadership. Ukraine has lost a lot of its actually properly trained, experienced military officers. What it is left with are young men were promoted into positions just because they needed to put somebody there, not because they had experience or the capability of doing this. And that is why you have many of these inadequate officers leading these large units. And I remember the Western media even celebrating as if it was a good thing that there were so many young senior officers in the Ukrainian military, when in reality, that is a symptom of losing a war of attrition. Business Insider goes on and it says the 155th has also been moving soldiers to other units in need of replenishment. And according to Budasov, it's dealt with at least 7 significant personnel changes since March. Drone jamming specialists in the 155th, for example, had to fill infantry roles amid a manpower shortage, he wrote. Again, it's hard enough to find and train properly infantry. It's even harder to train these specialists. Budasov's report has since drawn outcry among Ukrainian figures such as Lieutenant Colonel Bohdan Krodyech, who serves as chief of staff in the Azov Brigade, which are Nazis. They are modern-day Nazis in Ukraine. They have literal Nazi insignia on their uniform and flags. And so this is what he says. Perhaps it's sheer idiocy to create new brigades and equip them with new technology while existing ones are undermanned, he wrote on X. Which again points out that this problem with this French-trained brigade is just part of a much, much larger problem where all of Ukraine's military is being hollowed out little by little, and the cracks are getting bigger and spreading out further. A well-known Ukrainian lawyer who provides crowd-funded drones to military units said his organization was assisting the 155th because the brigade lacked officially provided drones and jammers. So this goes back to the point I made about France having never fought a war like this, not being prepared to train their own troops, let alone foreign troops, to fight in a conflict like this. And of course, if they're not prepared just even to train their troops properly, they surely don't have the equipment to fight a conflict like this properly, including these cheap and very numerous drones that are so important on the battlefield, in and over the battlefields of Ukraine. You sent this brigade to France, they're going to train you based on their Cold War era and War on Terror era doctrine. They're not going to teach you how to actually fight the conflict taking place in Ukraine, and they surely don't have the equipment, arms, and munitions to help you go fight that conflict. This is the point that even Business Insider is laying out, even if they don't say it clearly enough. Why create a new brigade when existing brigades are critically understaffed, only to later divide it and transfer personnel to old brigades? What's the point? They wrote on Tuesday on their Telegram channel. The brigade's fate threatens to mar the legacy of Macron's efforts to position France as a staunch ally of Ukraine. Paris has pledged some $3 billion in military aid to Kiev. Macron has been one of the most vocal European leaders pushing for Ukraine's accession to the European Union. Then the article says President Macron has also floated the idea of sending French troops to Ukraine if Russia were to score a massive breakthrough. How do we think that will go? If France is incapable of training Ukrainians and has no appropriate equipment to give them to go fight the Russians, how are they themselves going to go fight the Russians? One thing that France will have available, at least in the beginning, will be significant amounts of air power that Ukraine never had, even at the beginning of this conflict. They will have that. They will have whatever is left of their long-range missiles. They will have a certain amount of trained, cohesive military units, but how long will they last on the battlefield against the much larger Russian military? And this is where the conflict has ended up. It has ended up with the Ukrainian military being unable to continue fighting. They are collapsing. It is a slow motion collapse happening in front of us day by day, week by week, now month by month. And again, this leaves the West with only two choices: accept that this is where the conflict is heading, accept the inevitable, or to intervene and attempt to change the course of this conflict by replacing Ukrainian forces with Western forces. The temptation is there, and there have been actually many steps taken to prepare for this contingency. I have a bad feeling that this is the decision they will ultimately make. And we have to remember that this conflict in Ukraine isn't necessarily about winning the conflict in Ukraine. It is about extending Russia, getting Russia to overextend itself and eventually collapse, either militarily, economically, politically, or a combination of all three. This is exactly what the US did to Syria, successfully, I might add. And it was also part of overextending Russia, which to an extent has been successful. If Russia could have held on in Syria, continued supporting the government of Bashar al-Assad, President Bashar al-Assad, they would have, but they were unable to because they have focused their resources and their attention on Ukraine, and they did not have additional resources available to continue supporting Syria. So we have to remember, this is not just the conflict in Ukraine. This is a much larger conflict between the US, its proxies, and an emerging multipolar world order. That is what is actually happening here. And it stretches far beyond Ukraine. It stretches from Ukraine across all of Eurasia, all the way to East Asia, the Asia-Pacific region, the Middle East, Africa, even Latin America. It is a global conflict. The US is trying to overextend Russia and Ukraine, not necessarily win the conflict in Ukraine. And if that means sending European forces in there to extend this conflict longer and try to stretch Russia out further, then that is what they will do. Now, this is how the Business Insider article ends. Overall, the Anne of Kiev Brigade is just one of several training projects that France and Europe have been working on with Ukraine. Since late 2022, over 63,000 Ukrainian troops have been trained under the European Union Military Assistance Mission, a EU-funded program that gets member states to teach and equip Kiev's forces. The program has a $420 million budget for the next 2 years, ending in November 2026. All of these training programs have ended in the exact same way, just as NATO's 8-year training program of Ukrainian brigades ended in disaster, with all of those units now having, for all intents and purposes, having been wiped out. That trained manpower no longer exists in significant quantities. This has been spread out across whatever is left of Ukraine's military. And again, that is according to the West, the Western media, not Russia. Now, speaking of desertion, it was not just this one poorly trained, poorly equipped brigade trained and equipped in and by France. This is a problem that is spreading across all of Ukraine's armed forces. Desertions spark panic and pardons in Ukraine's army. So instead of punishing deserters, Ukraine is begging them to come back in exchange for amnesty. So again, this is a military-wide problem. This is what the France 24 article from December 27th, 2024 says. Figures published by the Ukrainian General Prosecutor's Office show that more than 90,000 cases have been opened into instances of soldiers going absent without leave or deserting since Russia invaded in 2022, with a sharp increase over the past year. So it is getting worse. And it's 90,000, many more than the 63,000 Ukrainian troops Europe has trained and equipped, just to compare and put it into scale and context. Now, the article talks about why these troops are leaving. They're leaving because they're tired. They never get relief. They're never rotated home and given a break. They are constantly on the front line. They're in horrible conditions, and of course, they're not receiving enough arms and ammunition while they're sitting on the front line endlessly, and so they decide to leave. I think it's a rational decision to be made under those conditions, especially considering why this war is being fought in the first place, and for whose interests this war is being fought in the first place. Certainly not Ukraine's interests. Now, what are the consequences of these desertions and the general deterioration of Ukraine's armed forces? That is the loss of territory, even very heavily defended territory. So let's take a look at this NPR article. Again, this is Western media. NPR receives funding from the US government, indisputably pro-Western, pro-Ukrainian media, and yet this is what they're reporting. Ukrainian soldiers and shopkeepers hold on as Russia's siege of Pokrovsk tightens. And again, Pokrovsk is here, west of Donetsk, this urban built-up area that Russia is now encircling. This is what NPR says. A grinding siege began last spring as waves of Russian soldiers, backed by artillery and remote-controlled drones, advanced slowly through nearby farms and villages, beginning a gradual encirclement. In the months since, Moscow has gained ground steadily, but at an extremely high cost. An analysis by the Institute for the Study of War, a think tank in Washington, D.C., estimates Russia has lost roughly 3,000 soldiers killed and seriously wounded while trying to capture Pokrovsk during a 2-week period in December. But actually, ISW did not draw that conclusion. If you click on the link in the NPR article, it brings you to this ISW report. If you come down here where they cited it, it's actually another report by ISW, which again cites another report by ISW, which eventually cites some Ukrainian officer who just claimed this. It's this article here. This was originally in Ukrainian. It is translated into English, and it's just this guy saying they killed 2,883 soldiers, killed or wounded. It's not really clear what is what. They continuously, the Ukrainian military and government, the US military and government, the Western media continuously make these claims about huge, unsustainable Russian losses. They've been saying this for the last 3 years, although quite obviously Russia is sustaining whatever losses they are taking. But let's just continue reading through this NPR article and several other recent articles about the nature of the fighting in Ukraine, and you tell me if you think Russia is somehow losing more troops than Ukraine is. NPR also says, Pokrovsk was once home to 60,000 people, a humble industrial city. For much of the war, it was relatively safe, but over the last year, Russia carved deeper into Ukrainian territory along a wide swath of the Eastern Front. So they are breaking through and they are gaining territory because Ukrainian military defenses are collapsing. The guys are holding on by every means, said a gray-bearded military ambulance driver in a green cap who gave his name as Sergei. The 58-year-old is commander of the Shark Medical Evacuation Unit of the 117th Separate Heavy Mechanized Brigade. He added that some units defending the city are frustrated because they aren't getting the support they need. It's politics, Sergei said. We don't have enough shells and other supplies, which is what I have been saying for years now, and that this would be a fundamental problem that would never be solved and would ultimately contribute to the complete collapse of Ukraine's fighting capacity. In December, Ukraine's military replaced the general who was leading the defense of Pokrovsk after he failed to stop Russia's advance. But most military analysts say the stark reality is that Russia's army is simply much larger, fielding with more men, more artillery, more shells. So it's outnumbering Ukraine, outfighting Ukraine, outgunning Ukraine. So how is Ukraine somehow killing more Russian soldiers than Russia is killing Ukrainian soldiers? Doesn't make any sense because it's propaganda. It's not supposed to make sense. It's just supposed to tell people what they want to hear, what they want to believe, despite the facts. NPR continues, and it cites ISW again, the Institute for the Study of War, based in Washington, D.C., and directed by U.S. think tank policymakers who have jumped in and out of U.S. government and who have basically helped engineer this conflict in the first place. Barros, an analyst with ISW, said in 2024, Ukraine was forced to retreat, but its forces have also slowed Russia's advance while killing or injuring as many as 30,000 Russian soldiers every month along the entire front, according to estimates compiled by Barros's group and other military analysts. He believes losses on that scale may be unsustainable for Moscow. Well, if Russia was actually suffering those losses, they would be unsustainable. Clearly, they are sustaining these losses, so it's very unlikely that these numbers are correct. And I just showed you where these numbers come from. Just one example, just an officer running defenses around Pokrovsk after his senior officer was relieved of duty. So, of course, it's in his interest to make it appear as if he is succeeding, even as Ukraine admittedly is losing territory and being outfought, outnumbered, outgunned by Russia. Now, these admissions of Ukraine's collapsing fighting capacity are not meant to redirect the process taking place in Ukraine toward any sort of rational resolution, conflict resolution. As Alexander Mikiris of the Duran pointed out, comments like this, comments by President Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine admitting to how dire the situation is not a step in the direction toward finally ending this conflict. No, it is to justify ever drastic measures to keep the conflict going for as long as possible. So when President Zelensky talks about how desperate the situation is, how they don't have enough troops, how they're losing the war, it's so that he can sell to the Ukrainian population conscripting 18-year-olds. That's what it's actually for. I completely agree with Alexander's analysis in that regard. Let's read another article. This one is from U.S. government. Media outlet Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, is literally funded by the U.S. government. And this is what they're reporting about the conflict in Ukraine. Russia advances, Ukraine struggles. The war turns grimmer for Kiev. Flanked, overwhelmed, and almost overrun, Ukrainian forces are struggling to hold back a Russian army that has more men, more firepower, and overall momentum across frozen fields and muddy trenches in eastern Ukraine. Pokrovsk, a city with a pre-war population of 60,000, is the biggest location where Ukraine's defenses are at risk of buckling under relentless Russian assault. It's far from the only one, however. So another admission from U.S. government-funded media, no less, that the Russian military is larger, better armed, and outfighting Ukraine. They talk about Pokrovsk, of course, being encircled. They talk about Kharkovo, which was, again, this area down here, that Russian forces have now fully taken over just from January 1st to January 5th. They also talk about Kursk, the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. This is what it says. Ukrainian command has drawn plaudits in the past for innovative and improvised tactics, repelling the bigger Russian invading force in the defense of Kiev in the early days of the invasion stunned many, including the Kremlin. Ukraine's creativity in the Black Sea has helped minimize Russia's effectiveness there. Again, doing what? What are they referring to? They never explain. The August invasion of Russia's Kursk region fit that pattern, but it failed to accomplish one major goal: relieving pressure elsewhere by drawing away Russian units. Russia, meanwhile, pulled its own surprise, bringing in thousands of North Korean troops to the battlefield, a move that itself helps relieve recruiting pressure inside Russia. Now, there's still, whether this is happening or not, I have no idea. I'm not there. I don't know who is fighting on the front line in Kursk. All I know is I have not seen a single shred of evidence to sustain this claim that has now been circulating for months. An entire chain of events, according to the Western media, has unfolded because of these supposed North Korean troops fighting in and around Kursk, but there's still not a single shred of evidence to substantiate these claims. I've not seen any video or photographic or even documented evidence suggesting that there are even North Korean troops there, let alone fighting on the front line. I have not seen any dead North Korean troops, and I've not heard any specific explanation or description of the type of fighting, the weapons and tactics the North Koreans are employing along the line of contact. I haven't heard anything like that at all, just these ambiguous claims that they are there, and that is all. The article continues. Though U.S. officials last month said North Korea has suffered at least several hundred casualties, the North Koreans have played a key role in pushing back Ukrainian defenses in the Kursk region town of Sudzha, close to the border. That is the small population center that I showed you in that little and shrinking area of operation the Ukrainians are in Kursk. In total, Ukrainian forces are estimated to have lost more than half of the territory they initially seized over the summer. That ultimately could wipe another apparent goal that Ukrainian officials hoped would come from the invasion, using occupied Russian territory as a bargaining chip in future negotiations. Now, whether they were able to hold that territory or not, Russia would never accept that as a term, as a condition in negotiations. They would never accept that. They would take that territory back at all costs if it came down to that. The point is, whether they're North Koreans or not, listen to what we're expected to believe. We were told that these are North Koreans. They're, on average, they're smaller because they're all malnourished. They haven't been in any sort of armed conflict for decades and decades. The soldiers themselves have never been in an actual conflict. They're poorly trained, they're poorly equipped, they have poor motivation, they're going to run away inside Russia. And now we're expected to believe that they have faced off against these larger, stronger Uber soldiers trained and armed by NATO. They're somehow outfighting them and driving them out of Russian territory. It begs belief. And it ties in knots the West's own narratives, the narratives they themselves are creating and attempting to convince the public of. Now, one final point I want to make is about U.S. military support for Ukraine. We keep hearing about how the incoming Trump administration is going to cut off aid from Ukraine. They're not going to support Ukraine. Ukraine is going to lose because of the incoming Trump administration. Ukraine's going to lose, period. They're not going to win this conflict. Unless the collective West intervenes, Ukraine is going to lose this conflict. That is inevitable. Everyone admits that on all sides at this point. Whether President Biden was reelected or whether the incoming Trump administration cuts aid or expands aid, it doesn't matter, because the weapons and ammunition simply do not exist in the quantities necessary to change the course of this conflict. It simply doesn't. The last arms package sent to Ukraine, dated December 30th, 2024, right at the end of the year, are the exact same collection of arms and ammunition that the U.S. has been giving Ukraine every month, because this is all being drawn from monthly production. These are not new items, new capabilities being given to Ukraine. These are the same limited capabilities the U.S. has been providing Ukraine all along, because it's monthly production, it's annual production, it's military industrial production overall is insufficient for a conflict of this nature. And I'll go over them again as I always do. Munitions for the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System, NASAMS. So these are air-to-air missiles that are used in a ground surface-to-air mission for air defense. Hawk air defense munitions. These are antiquated. The U.S. military no longer uses them. They had to refurbish all of these missiles. Very few nations around the world still use the Hawk air defense system because they don't feel like buying a newer, more modern system. They're not serious about air defense. And so this is what the U.S. is handing Ukraine. Notice how Patriot missiles are not mentioned at all. Stinger missiles, so these are man-portable air defense systems. The U.S. makes fewer missiles each month than there are air defense units in Ukraine that needs them. And that's if every single missile produced monthly were sent to Ukraine, which they most likely aren't. Counter unmanned aerial systems munitions. I don't know what they're referring to. There's no specific details. Are these systems for shooting down drones? Are they systems for jamming drones? I don't know. It doesn't really make it clear. Ammunition for high mobility artillery rocket system, HIMARS. HIMARS, ATACMS, we're not really hearing much about them recently, do we? We hear about attacks into Russia with these missiles. We hear about Russia shooting them down. We hear almost nothing. For example, this article just today, Moscow vows retaliation for Ukraine strike with U.S.-made missiles. They're talking about ATACMS. When they talk about the article, they talk about the incident, they talk about Russia's response to it. Nowhere in the article do they talk about any damage done to any target in Russia, civilian or military. They don't mention it at all, and I think if they hit something significant, that would be the headline. 155 and 105 millimeter artillery ammunition. Again, I've talked about this for years. They don't make enough. They will never make enough. Ukraine has no way of matching Russia in terms of artillery, and this is essentially an artillery and drone war. Air to ground munitions. So this would be glide bombs, maybe, being used by whatever's left of Ukraine's Air Force, which isn't much, not enough to make any sort of difference. Also, high-speed anti-radiation missiles, HARMs. These are supposed to target Russian air defense radar systems. I have not heard of any success of these in the last at least 2 years that the U.S. has been sending them. Unmanned aerial systems, again, an assortment of drones. I've not heard of any U.S.-made drone making any difference at all in this conflict, even from the Western media itself. Then we have Javelin and AT-4 anti-armor systems, as well as the tube-launched, optically guided, wire-tracked tow missiles. Again, I've talked about this over and over again. They're made in such small quantities. The hit rate alone is around 19% for properly trained U.S. troops. So it's going to be even lower for Ukrainians, meaning U.S. is incapable of sending Ukraine more missiles that will actually hit and destroy their targets than Russia is capable of actually just building entire armored vehicles and putting them on the battlefield every single month. Now, they also talk about small arms and ammunition, grenades, demolition equipment and munitions, secure communication equipment, and also commercial satellite imagery services, which is an item that sounds like they just put it in there to make the list look longer. Of course, we know throughout the entirety of this conflict, the U.S. has been providing military-grade satellite imagery for Ukraine. They are picking the targets, and they're entering the targeting data for Ukraine to hit targets deep in Russian-held territory and also Russian territory itself. So commercial satellite imagery services, Ukraine themselves could buy this for themselves. They don't need the U.S. to buy this for them. Very odd. Medical equipment, clothing and individual equipment, and spare parts, maintenance and sustainment, support, services, training, and transportation. So virtually every aspect of what a military needs to sustain itself, Ukraine depends on the U.S. and Europe at this point. Again, it is a proxy war being fought through Ukraine. It's not Ukraine fighting this war. It is the West fighting this war against Russia through Ukraine. And it's another package that represents America's inability to produce enough weapons and ammunition for Ukraine just to match Russia, let alone overpower Russia militarily. And this is a problem that there is a solution, but the U.S. is never going to implement it. It would be to nationalize its arms industry, which will never happen. So this problem will never be solved. So not only will Ukraine continue to lose, but any conflict the U.S. seeks to fight in the future against a peer or near-peer adversary who has large amounts of arms and ammunition and a large military-industrial production capacity, they are simply going to have to respond asymmetrically, which they are, and it's still extremely dangerous, and it still calls into question how all of this will end, but it's not going to end with the United States militarily defeating Russia or China in a peer-to-peer, head-to-head military confrontation. And even if they were able to make enough arms and ammunition to supply Ukraine to meet or exceed what the Russian military-industrial base is capable of producing, the problem still comes down to trained manpower. Ukraine doesn't have enough, and they will never have enough. There's no way to train properly enough Ukrainians to replace what they are losing every single day, week, and month. Which again brings us back to the increasing likelihood that the West itself will intervene in Ukraine. Now, we continuously hear about how the U.S., the incoming Trump administration isn't interested in Ukraine. They want to end the conflict in Ukraine. No, they do not. They want Europe to step in and take over full responsibility so the U.S. can pivot toward Iran and China. And that includes a coalition of the willing of European nations that will send their troops into Ukraine. They will be supported by the U.S. at least indirectly, if not directly, but at least indirectly, because this is how the U.S. conducts its foreign policy, through proxies, a massive global network of proxies. So this is what we have to keep an eye on as 2025 unfolds. I will continue keeping an eye on all of this. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for all the other places you can find and follow my work. All of my videos go up on YouTube, Rumble, Telegram, and X, and maybe future platforms if I can find them. Also in the video description are all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. It's not doing me any good. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon.